So the reason I've chosen this Drouet study, it's number 16 from the Drouet book, is it looks incredibly simple on the page, but I really like it because of all the different characterizations you can get in the music. The opening for me feels between the worlds of Mahler and Wagner. So if you think of a chorale of Wagner tubas, or even the violin sound that you get at the beginning of the last movement of Mahler 9, it's actually the same note, although I think it's A flats rather than G sharps. But so the kind of sound I have in my head is a more metallic, darker sound than you would naturally get on a flute. So for the opening few bars, as I said, if you think about that opening of the Mahler, that intensity of the intonation of the octave to check the tuning of the bottom G sharp and the top G sharp, but it's the connection of those notes and direction of the air that I'm really concentrating on. The next thing I want to talk about is the way to phrase the diminuendos, for instance in bar 5 and 6. Now, there should be a release of energy in air, a soft release at the beginning of the sound with energy, but not an attack. It's not hitting the sound with an accent, but releasing the air in a way. One way to do that, and it's a type of articulation I use quite a lot, especially for playing super quietly at the top and for pinging notes out of the bottom of the flute, to direct the air, all of the air, into the right places, what I call forward tonguing or per tonguing, where you physically put your tongue between the lips. Maybe I'll do a separate video on that. But in this instance, it helps me release the air in a soft way and lets the air have this decay to produce a really lovely diminuendo, hopefully. And this is especially the case at the end of the piece, in the last kind of 2 or 3 lines. The same thing, it should be a really heartfelt sigh, like somebody's pulling at the heartstrings. So. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is how I internalise this rhythm going with the subdivisions from one subdivision to the next. So if I just subdivide some of the beats that you can kind of hear in what's going on internally. The hardest bar in this piece is bar 15, by the way, with the triplets. And what I'm thinking about this is getting the airstream through the flute with vibrato. It's one of my bugbears that some players, and myself included, sometimes rely on what the instrument wants you to do rather than what is musically written. So there's certain mannerisms that come out of certain types of playing. Regardless of what the rhythm is, if you want to play with vibrato, it should go through all the notes. There shouldn't be certain notes that are dead with no vibrato and then lots of vibrato on the next note. So for instance, in this bar, bar 15, that's the most tricky bar, is to have this singing vibrato, not massive amount of vibrato, but enough to shimmer that is constant through the bar. And it will help the legato and negotiate the intervals. They're tricky intervals, and so when you're doing intervals like this, for instance, the speed of the air at the end of the top E needs to be slower before you get to the G sharp, otherwise the G sharp's going to in danger of splitting up or it's going to bump. And the same thing at the end of the G sharp to get to the D sharp, the air speed needs to be faster and accelerated in between the notes, not on the D sharp, because it will bump as well. So it's this constant negotiation of how much air you're going to use for the interval and the speed of the air to make it as smooth as possible and not make it a feature in a bad way. So let's see if I can try and negotiate this from bar 13. My next point, the next thing that I'm thinking about is how to turn that corner, maybe taking a bit of time with the triplets at the end of bar 16, but to produce this lovely change of colour and mood exactly with the recap of the tune from the beginning on the bar line of 17 and setting that up. So if I play maybe from the upbeat of 16. So what I'm thinking about doing with that reduction of the diminuendo and the change of colour is I often think about the old French way of doing this when they're doing a diminuendo. Sometimes people would lift the air away from the flute, and that's fine, but it changes the colour and you get a little bit of extra air in the sound. I mean, my view of kind of dynamics should always be that it should be like an expensive stereo, that when you turn down the volume or you turn up the volume, the quality of sound shouldn't be distorted. So I try and think of it, it's interesting looking into a camera when I'm recording this video, I think of an aperture on a camera. So what I mean by that is that when you're playing loudly, you play with a wide airstream and a loss of air, and when you're playing quietly, you reduce this airstream and embouchure, size of embouchure, much smaller, to the point that you close the door, that there's still pressure behind the door, which is what makes the sound have quality and stay in terms of the pitch and intonation. But it's just on a much smaller scale rather than lifting the air away from the flute, where you get this diffuse or slightly unfocused, airy sound. So, I mean, the example I always use is the end of Syrinx. Maybe one of the ways to do it would be, as I said, to lift the air away, but it ends up sounding a little bit like one of those kettles, old-fashioned kettles that you put on the stove, boiling away. And you get that whistle, that can happen. Whereas the way I would like to do it is really think much more of dynamic range of maybe like a clarinet, where they don't have that extra air because of the resistance of the reed and blowing against the reed and just closing the door in the same way. So I'm thinking about making the hole much smaller, almost having, like I say when I'm teaching young kids, having an airstream of like spaghetti coming out of your mouth to the end of the room and controlling it that way. So the difference of the sound is you have a much more pure sound, and actually at the back of a hall it will project much further, and at the end of the note the audience is guessing whether the note is still going on, which is a fantastic effect to have. The next thing is negotiating the turn. So when I think of turns in this kind of tempo, think of it as a kind of a Mozart piano concerto that you would often have maybe half and half. So you would have a semicolon on the F sharp and then move as in 4 demis to fill in the rest of the gap. So that's the kind of pacing of that. So if we do a couple of beats before. Now with this next bar in bar 24, I think of something like the cor anglais solo in William Tell of these triplets, but I mean in a way this wants to move forward with the hairpins as well. It's slightly implied, so it wants to have a swell as well as a sense of moving forward and giving the time with these breaths in between these triplets the way it's written. So it would be something like thing to consider in bar 28 over these next 2 bars with this what I call a hairpin, crescendo diminuendo, is to make your playing more 3-dimensional. You can do these kind of crescendo diminuendos with colour as well as dynamic, and it makes it more 3D, as I say, rather than 2D on a page. So as you get louder, you could maybe explore getting darker into the colour, and then as you get quieter, reducing that intensity of colour as well, and it just makes it a much bigger variation. The 2 bars that just spring to mind are the Foro Pavane of doing the trill at the end of the solo, the first solo, with the E sharp to F sharp trill. Something like that. So in this instance I would do something like going into the sound with the colour as well as crescendoing with the triplets. And the other thing to check with this way of doing it is that the intonation is exactly level. So all of those G sharps, regardless of how you're doing the colour or which dynamic you're playing at, should be exactly in the same place. So we've already talked about the sighing near the end of the piece. Then for me, this sighing, actually we'll play that again. The sighing thing from 33, this reminds me of a soprano aria at the end of an opera where the soprano, something tragic has happened and she's been stabbed in the chest or something, but she still has the energy and the ability to sing an amazing 5-minute beautiful aria. So that's the kind of feeling that I have in my head with this, first of all the sighing, but also this da-di-da-di, it's just like the heartbeat at the end of the opera, and then the curtains close, just to finish the tale. So let's have a go at this last line and a half, or couple of lines. Now the things to think about with that figure at the end is obviously tuning wise, you want to keep the pitch up, and I always think of trying to play sharp. I mean, it's very difficult to play sharp in that register and dynamic. You'll never play sharp, you'll just be playing in tune. There's other things you can do. I use lots of fake fingerings sometimes when I'm playing in the orchestra, but often I'll use them as a way of creating a colour or thinking about a pitch in my head that I'm aiming for with the real fingering. So in this instance, you could maybe experiment it with the D sharps. You could just slightly touch the second trill key with your fourth ring finger and just slide over, not opening it completely, but it will just give it an extra brightness that will make the sound a bit too fake. But that's the sort of pitch that you want and colour that you want to have in your head. The same thing with the middle E. You could touch and vent slightly, not all the way down, it sounds too fake or too sharp, but just touch the second trill key for the middle E to make it slightly brighter as an experiment. And then when you're playing it for real, to still have that idea of the colour in your head will really help. Often, I mean, the biggest use case of that is the Poulenc Sonata, the opening, and any kind of really quiet top E's. Another one is Romeo and Juliet. But I mean, often I'll just have my finger hovering over the key, and that will be enough psychologically without having to employ it. So just experiment with those. So I mean, what I'm talking about is, can you hear when I'm pushing it, it's going up a little bit, and the same thing with the E. It's too high, but you want to have a little bit of that in the intonation and colour when you're playing it in the context of the piece. So there's just a few thoughts. I hope you enjoyed the study and you explore these things and come up with your own suggestions for different colours and characterizations of the whole piece. It's just one of my favourite studies for those reasons that I've expressed in this video, and I hope you get something from it. Thanks for listening.